All right, well, thanks everyone for joining us. This is actually the part, I always love all my kids equally. I've loved all the talks, but this is the part I was actually looking forward to the most. So first question I have to ask is to Eric. I don't want you to feel out of place or intimidated by the panel here. Are you okay? Because it's about feeling comfortable. So are you okay? Okay. Excellent. So we want to make sure everybody's comfortable. So for those of you who are involved in some of the planning, what we did this year, every time we do our conferences, we talk about, and everybody, I have to tell you, on my board, from my board on down, agrees, that it's really sort of the next generation. And in our group, we're not talking about just the people that are, there's a whole bunch of efforts on K-12 education and undergrads, but it's really that people, the group that's spanning that group between typically graduate school, not always, but typically with these students graduate school, and their first 5 years of being in the workforce. And that's our student and young professionals group. And every time we've done this, people have said, you know, if you really want to talk about the future, you really need to get them up there and get them involved. And we've tried futures panels, and we thought, but you know, there's so much wisdom in reflecting where we've been. So what we did this year was kind of combine one of our philosophies that we use with our watershed workshops, where we have some sponsorship applicants to come to the conference. We've got our Student and Young Professionals Committee. And what we did was we had them apply, and they became kind of working groups for each of our core sessions. So each of these groups met, at least telephonically, before the meeting. They were led by sort of mentors. So we've been talking about whether that's the right word. They were joined with more vintage colleagues, one from an end user community and one from an academic community. And these groups were charged with saying this, and I told them right before we came in here, having done a lot of workshops, it's that 90% done where that energy level is sinking, and you know you're supposed to pull things together, and I can tell you that synthesizing hurts your head, and said, I want you to think about the questions, want to go through. We all know that we're attracted to this idea of knowledge to action, but actually putting your finger on where you can make that happen in this space is the toughest thing, and you heard that in the discussions. Lots of discussion about having to get around that discussion locally, but I always say to people, this, from my perspective, this game in water is about finding an opening and creating a parade that people want to join. And so what they were all challenged to do was said you can use the sessions. They actually helped engage with how we were structuring the sessions, and that's why we didn't have them all so that you could jump from session to session and know when the speakers were, because it was up to those groups how they would handle it. And I challenged them at the end to come up and give you a few minutes, tell you what they heard. And we didn't give them specific questions, but they were each challenged with coming up and telling you what they saw were the two, and they didn't get to do 4, they didn't get to do 5, and they're very disciplined, so they're coming up with 2. The best opportunities where there's some combination, if not all, of the desire to do something. Somebody who wants to pitch is there, the capacity is there, somebody who wants to catch is there, and the ability to bring those pieces together provides the best possibility to get a parade that's going forward. So what I've done is I've asked them, I didn't appoint them, they selected 2 members from their group to come up and tell you, and if you are like Sarah Jane and myself and always want to be in all the sessions at one time, you always want to hear what happened. I don't mean give me a summary report, I can read that on the website. I want to know, what did you hear? That was either good news, bad news. What did you really take out of it? So that's really their job. So we're going to go, and they're going to introduce themselves, partly because I can't do a good job reading all the bios, and partly because they'll do a much better job, and you'll get a better flavor of them introducing themselves. So that's where they're basically going to tell you, here's what we heard, and here's where we think the 2 best opportunities are. So we're democratically going to go in just in the order of the sessions that are listed in the program. So I have Eric and Jackie. They're going to tell you what happened. For those of you who weren't in the Blue Cities, Resilient Blue Cities sessions, are going to tell you about it. And for those of you who were, think about what you're hearing. Reflect on it first, and then join us in the questions. So we'll go through all 3 first, and then we'll have a few questions. I might run a little late to getting us into lunch. I absolutely want you back here for on time. For our Lieutenant Governor, which is going to be a spectacular speech, but we'll go a little bit late, just for those of you who are looking and saying, why isn't she keeping herself on time? I've already added a bit. So we'll go through all 3, and then we'll get some questions going. Is it Ryan, I think? Or who yes, there you go. So he gets first dib at the mic, so he gets to steer where we go. So if you think we're running out of time, suck up to him and make sure he can get your question in. So. All right, with that, we'll turn it over to Eric and Jackie.
Perfect. Well, good morning, everybody. I wanted to take on behalf of all of the groups up here and our Blue Cities team to thank Canadian Water Network for the opportunity. I am close to being a vintage colleague, so I'm at the upper age range for the group. And we also want to thank Kaylin for serving as our mentor, our coordinator. We also wanted to acknowledge all of the team members of our Blue Cities team. So we quickly stand up for 5 seconds, just kind of wave. Everybody's on different parts. So these are the young professionals of the future. So the work we did was wanting to summarize what we...
I have to be the bad mom and say, first you must introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry,
Before
yeah.
you tell a story, they want to know who you are.
I forgot. So I'm Eric Melton, project manager for Partners in Project Green on the water stewardship side, which is part of the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. Takes about 90 seconds to explain. I have 5. So what we wanted to do is actually look at...
What about me?
Sorry.
Hi, I'm Jackie Belzel, and I work for Blue Currents Consulting. And if you've never heard of it, well, that's just because it's just me. But maybe you will hear more.
But you probably will in the future. Hear more of it. Thank you both for that. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
See, you guys got it easier by me picking on them. Just smile and
Yeah. We didn't practice this, so this is what happens. So we started off with wanting to summarize for everybody what happened in the Blue Cities, I guess, panels that were done over the last 2 days. So to make it simple, Julia Fortier from Waterlution put together a word cloud for everybody, so she can actually send this out to people if they want to see what happened in those sessions. We wanted to highlight 2 points or 2 takeaways from those sessions. Before we started, one of the questions what we wanted to ask the audience in relation to Blue Cities is think of a time when you've tried to do something important in your life and think about would you be able to do it bigger and better? Think about that for Blue Cities.
And I think that really brings us to one of the core messages and opportunities that we heard, which is engagement. And as part of transforming our world into a place where we have increasingly large urban centers, but not increasing water, we need to look for opportunities to work together across disciplines, across sectors, across cultures in a lot of ways, in order to make it so that we can come up with the solutions that we need to address our water problems, to live well on this world and with this world. So one of the things that we heard in the sessions over and over again was the need to engage, either through governance, either through dialogue, problem definition. And so the first thing I want to do today is engage you and do a little bit of a camp exercise. Could everyone in the room who loves their job raise their hand? Right. That's a lot of people. So that is definitely an opportunity. And I have one more question for you. How many people in this room see their role as one of service? Yeah. So we have a lot of people who love their work and who want to serve. And something that stuck out to me yesterday that Rob Renner said in one of the sessions was that in the utility community, you have a lot of people who think of themselves or work in silent service. And I think one of the things that we need to do more of is to find our stories and tell our stories, because the power of words is going to help us move forward collectively on our missions. And so I would ask everyone to collaborate on making those stories, which is the next point, and work together to figure out in each of our own niches how we can tell a story better so that we don't end up like the Netherlands with an American writing a story about how their foundational water relationship is. The other thing we heard a lot about in these sessions was the opportunities created by crisis. And one of the things that we can do is prepare what our stories are and what we'd like to do before the crisis, so that when the opportunity of crisis comes and the window opens, we're ready. So in Australia, they had a massive drought and lots of money to do lots of amazing innovations and things. And a lot of those opportunities have now closed now that there's been a change in government. And one of the heartening things I heard was that they are preparing to move forward and look at the opportunities that the consolidation of that innovation have to present. And with that, I'd like to pass it on to Eric.
Perfect. Jackie's the straight man today.
Straight person.
Sorry, straight person, yes.
No offense taken, you're the only guy on the board.
So to tie in the engagement side, what it leads into is innovation. So for Blue Cities to evolve, we need innovation. This is what we kind of heard throughout the 2 days. How does that evolve from there? Information is where to start. So we were talking about opportunity and crisis, looking at research, looking at modeling, looking at challenges that municipal stakeholders are taking or undertaking, looking at what industrial end users are having to deal with, looking at what community stakeholders are actually having to deal with as well. In regards to information, whatever is identified through that information gathering are served as factors or drivers to start working on building capacity for implementation. Implementation was shown from examples from Region of York, Waterloo Region, the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Initiative. We had examples from Australia, which was awesome to see because we never really get that perspective from an international side. But the implementation side now starts to build into the third point, which is the paradigm shift. It's a buzz term, it's a buzz perspective, but it's true. Paradigm shift, what are we talking about? Flip the barriers, being able to not just serve as risk mitigators, but actually looking at proactive solutions, looking at added value opportunities. So we're talking about taking away opportunities, wanting to maximize those opportunities. Green infrastructure, it's not that expensive now. It's not as challenging to do. Incentivization, these are all paradigm shift initiatives. So what we wanted to do is make sure that that gets done for the Blue Cities initiative.
Great, that was terrific. Thank you very much.
Anybody else?
I think I got my moderators and speakers already lining up for the next group, so that's great. Thanks both. So Annie and Catherine are now going to talk to us about the resource development and agriculture sessions.
So my name is Annie Dagg, and I'm a hydrogeologist, and I'm currently a water resource specialist for the New Brunswick Department of Environment and Local Government.
And I'm Catherine Dompierre. I'm a PhD student at the University of Saskatchewan. My research focuses on oil sands reclamation.
So before we start, we'd like our team to stand up, please, so that we can acknowledge everyone who took part. Big round of applause. And I think also to some really excellent assistants, the co-chairs, Hans Schreier and Kelly McKittrick, who couldn't be here, who really made my life easier and everyone's lives easier. And I know you don't want to be recognized, but could you stand up?
Yay!
Yay! Our horsewhip.
Take the opportunity to stand up, Sherry.
Yeah, thanks so much. Loved the word cloud, just to start off. I think it could have easily applied, your word cloud could have easily applied to our session, honestly. So that was really impressive. So a lot of the same themes that we were seeing in the plenary and also, I think, cutting across. But we really, some of the issues, challenges, opportunities, themes that we saw, the concept of knowledge integration was one. The knowledge is out there. There's definitely a pull for the science. There's a lot of innovation going on across all three sectors, but it's getting it used at the right level. From the agricultural, there's a lovely example of 20% of the farmers are producing 80% of the crops, and that 20% of those people, they don't have to worry about that. They're uptaking the technology. They're tweeting and Googling and social mediaing in the tractors on their smartphones and with their GPSs. It's getting that information to the other 80%, which maybe are having a bit more of an impact in terms of certainly when we look at watershed management and nutrient loading and runoff and whatnot. So information, so knowledge integration, information communication was something that cut across both days, as well as the consortium approach, moving from, as Carl Weatherwell from Canadian Mining Innovation Council alluded to, moving from what's in it for me to what's in it for me, for we. So a lot of companies, oil sands, energy, in the mining sector as well, coming together and sharing, so CASIA being an excellent example of that. So we certainly had some discussion about that, the value of listening and communication, And I think a really interesting one that kept us going for quite some time was the setting of bold goals, and seeing how there are some really bold goals being set out there in all three of these areas. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But so an example of that is, instead of asking the question of how can we better manage water or tailings, for example, how do we, instead of asking that question, how can we move to no tailings mining? That's a really bold goal that's being set right now. And just to sort of sum up, I guess, two other key issues. One was the valuation of water that kept coming up, especially on the first day when we had an economist on the panel, and how a very difficult question that is. And I know many water people in the room, we understand the challenge to what is the right value for water. And we were told that it was sort of an impossible, almost an impossible problem to solve, and GHG emissions were much easier. So that was interesting. And last but not least, we had quite a bit of discussion about play-based regulation and that move really to integrated watershed management, and how all three of our sort of sectors in the room, agriculture, mining, and the energy sector, resource development, don't communicate to each other. This was sort of a unique venue for them all to be at the table together. So thank you to the CWN for bringing them together, and the CWR, this conference, and hopefully there'll be more opportunity for that. Speaking of opportunities.
So onto the key opportunities.
Great segue there.
That we, the students and young professionals, observed during the resource development and agricultural sections. So the first one is the use of technology roadmaps. How many here know what a technology roadmap is? Put your hand up. Okay, so it's not heavily used. It was originally used in the information and communications technology sector, and it's to drive change by defining a goal and then setting the necessary short and long-term priority actions in order to reach that goal. So this is why our computers have really jumped forward so quickly over the last 10 years even. So we think that this could be applied to the resource development and agricultural sectors to drive change, but also to inform regulators. If the regulators are informed, then that means that they can adapt policy in order to match these changes in the industries, and that will have a more proactive approach to regulation. It also promotes industry-involved standards to minimize the us versus them. And this is being used by the Canada Mining Innovation Council. As Annie mentioned, they are setting those big idea goals, like removing tailings from the mining process, and they're doing that by setting out these technology roadmaps. The second key opportunity that we saw was for young professional mentorship and training in order to create translators. So we've talked a lot about bridging communications. We need to have those people that are standing in the middle of the bridge, that are able to convey a technical background or area to whatever audience they're dealing with. And so by exposing young professionals to the communications, marketing, business kind of areas, then we can build those translators. So this is something that can be used in all areas, not just resource development and agriculture, but typically in mining and oil sands or oil and gas, we have a lot of engineers that have trouble communicating.
For an example, like
hopefully
just
I'm not
as
one of
one
them.
example.
And we're both engineers, so
Yes.
we can say that.
So we have a third opportunity, so I'll make it short. But we want, or the industry has really brought up the need for the generation of forums for multi-stakeholder dialogue at the watershed level. So the CWN is starting to promote this idea of getting the watershed workshops together, but all of the players need to be there, particularly the industries, the First Nations, the scientists, the community members. Everyone needs to be there, agricultural farmers. And that would allow for all the players to be invested in what is being done. So when that forum is established, then they can all come together to establish their common vision and values and that will allow for the buy-in to make sure that that action really does happen. And so that's
Awesome learning. See how she got 3 in there and it did it. That was wonderful. Thank you both for that. So now on to Sandra and Megan to talk about our Aboriginal and small communities session.
My name is Megan Cott. I'm a PhD student at Dalhousie University. My research looks at small communities and implementing changes in small communities.
Hi, my name is Sandra Eager. I am a master's student at the University of Waterloo in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management.
And so our panel, we had some really good speakers, and I think I'd like to introduce our group first. They're sitting kind of over there, and Cecilia as well, and then Majid was also our lead. If you guys could just stand up. It's our scholarship group.
Where's Majid? Where's Majid? I don't think he stood up yet, has he?
He's not here.
He's not here, okay. Some of you met him in the session, so for those of us who didn't get to all, we like to see who we've met so we can spread the word.
And we had several very interesting and passionate discussions about what it's like to work in the small and in Aboriginal communities. And so our job, which was a bit tough, was to distill from that what were lessons that could apply across both types of communities. And what we came up with sort of 4 main themes. So we had people and relationships, and if you would imagine it as a triangle, these would be at the top. The most important thing is to have people and the relationships in a community. And people are needed to be able to address challenges, but also to understand the challenges that are presented before them, and then facilitate an appropriate solution. The next thing is appropriate technologies. And technology in the context of a small community or an Aboriginal community is not necessarily the Ferrari. It's the thing that works the best in that context. Then we have governance, governance as a key opportunity for change and for facilitating innovation in this context, and having regulators and regulations that allow and accept for innovative solutions. And then that innovation piece is something that all these 3 themes were all tied together around. We had one sort of hanging issue that came out at the end of the first session that sort of ties into what we've been talking about this morning and throughout our both panels as well. And that was the notion of, when we talk about knowledge to action, whose knowledge are we talking about? Are we talking about science? Are we talking about traditional knowledge? Are we talking about local knowledge? And how do those come together and work together to find a good solution? Whose action? So who's going to be taking the actions that are required to implement that knowledge and to affect change? And should we really, this is the ultimate one, should we really be going from knowledge to action as a goal, or should it be knowledge to wisdom to action? Mm-hmm. So we don't really have any solutions to that, so maybe something we can think about there.
Great. So over the last 2 days, panelists reminded us that we all need to be both responsive and adaptive, and that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. A point that resonated with us was how important it was to take into account both local and traditional knowledge, and that these are often either the keys to success or failures of projects. So we have some specific examples of opportunities for how we as a group could go about carrying this out. So I would like to, once again, everyone had the engagement portion of their presentation. So I would like to ask those of you who identify with government to raise your hand. Don't be shy. Okay. That's kind of half hands up. Okay. So a suggested opportunity that lies within government was some of the current regulations related to funding don't allow or account for long-term savings. And this is both in small communities or in First Nations communities. The ability or capacity for communities to carry over savings in a trust or reserve fund would have a direct and positive impact on infrastructure improvement, planning for asset management, and self-determination. So that was an important point for government. All right, so those of you who identify with consultants or consulting firms. Okay, a few, perfect. So one of the points that resonated with us was go into communities as a learner, not just as a teacher. Think longer term about the value of building relationships with and within communities. We've heard a good place to start is with a cup of tea. So hopefully some of you will get that. For those of you in academia, raise your hand. Okay, a little bit more. So we're talking about the paradigm shift, and there's lots of common themes that when you distill it down are quite common across all of the branches. And moving from that traditional paradigm, and we really identified the opportunity to conduct projects that respond to the needs of a community, to create partnerships over the course of your research, and additionally to share in a meaningful way the outcomes of that research. And if you need another suggestion, you can always have another cup of tea.
Tea, good. Okay, that tea, good. The idea.
So communities at the local level, who's here at the, everyone's a user, I suppose we could put it that way, but is anyone working at the local level, within a community, at the ground, in the grassroots sense? Okay, perfect. So one of the main points that we picked out were that operators are your unsung heroes, and they need your support. They need our support. Limitations mean that creativity may be required, particularly when skilled operators are being pulled to work in other more lucrative industries. For example, we heard about peer-to-peer networks that function as a powerful, low-cost tool for enhancing operator support. Furthermore, we heard the importance of working with youth in the community to improve water literacy and develop the next generation of operators. The support and care for water resources and infrastructure by end users represents the start of the culture change required to make water a priority in any of the communities going into the future.
And so last night we heard that no one really cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think that's something that we've heard everyone here kind of mention. And this is particularly true for those small communities and the representatives that came and talked to us over the 2 days of our panel. People have to, in order to feel how much people care, they also have to be trusted individuals. And we're challenging everyone in the room to engage in collaborations based on that elusive trust, where familiar issues can be brought into new light, and where appropriate, where what is appropriate shapes the ultimate outcome of any project. And that's all we had.
It's not just all, that's awesome. Thank you all. That was a terrific sum up. And I have to say that when we come back to some of these ideas and get ready, get to that microphone, that's a boy. There you go. That we're get ready. But I want to put in a plug. Catherine, when you talked about one of the things he saw as an opportunity with the YP and others is really having the opportunities to train the translators, train the people in this space. So I can tell every one of you, now that I have your emails, at some point, I want to call on you to help make that case. So we're going to be making that case, whether it's funding, whether it's creating that bridge, whether it's supporting that bridge. It's really building that support for, and it can be very brass tacks and pragmatic. It's the best dollar you spend if you need to get to this outcome, is putting these things in place, including, and it's not just the young professionals, but I find that's where the best uptake is, and frankly, the best capacity to do it, that there's a huge need, and that I want to engage this whole community in making that case, because there's a huge, not just it's a good idea case, this is straight value, folks. This is about how we actually going to get to action. In my view, that's probably one of the biggest ones. And it's hard to get people to invest in that if they think it's a long-term solution, but it's actually about relatively short-term gains. So that's a storytelling and a narrative that I think people here, I know we're speaking to the choir. So it's not about convincing you of that idea, it's convincing, and what you've heard all through that is that it's your collective talent in creating that story and that narrative and presenting it to those who can then help make that part an action that I'm going to call to. So thank you for all those suggestions, but I mean, I think this is the best example I can give you of why that's clearly the case. So we'll go to questions. I think you were here recently. Come on. Come on down. Introduce yourself.
My name is Jason Ryan. Thank you. Jason Ryan Solnick, and I was one of the scholarship members on the Blue Cities SYPC committee initiative. And my question pertains directly to the overall, excuse the pun, arch of bridging the chasm, and how how Barbara talked about on Monday, a new regime of regional governance, and where the idea of traditional knowledge can apply. And as young professionals, where in your degree or job or skill level have you seen this incorporation? Because as Cecilia aptly identified today, the most simplest idea of not going to the bathroom in pristine drinkable water is so foreign to Western societies. Like myself, growing up in Toronto, didn't even think of it until it was just put in front of you. So what other examples of traditional knowledge have you all come across, and where is it incorporating into your line of work? Thank you.
Anybody want to take that? Don't be afraid.
I can start.
Eric, please.
Okay. So I love the idea of translator. So it's one of those things that in our sector that I work in, I work as a representative of the Conservation Authority, but representing a facilitator for industrial end users to implement capital infrastructure projects on the water side. Really tough challenge of bridging that communication gap, understanding the language and the dialogue that both sides need to have in order to actually appreciate the stakeholders that are involved in actually doing a project together, the collaboration piece. So going back to JR's point, what's actually worked is low impact development. These are solutions that have been around for a long time. Some of them are new and advanced, but a lot of the solutions are pre-existing from examples that we heard about from the Netherlands, for example. Having those in place and building that dialogue and the capacity for the industrial end users to understand that that's actually valuable to them. Liability side, risk mitigation, triple bottom line, the business case itself of replication and retrofit of these projects. We're trying to do that from our side, and it is a challenge, but it's starting to see some uptake.
Well, let's go with Megan, and then I've asked this. I have a question. I want to continue the discussion with Cecilia, but let's start here.
Well, I was going to provide a different option for incorporating local knowledge and finding an appropriate solution. It was one of my research communities, but we also talked about it during the panel discussion yesterday, was the example of communities in Newfoundland that are having a lot of trouble bringing potable water into homes, just because of the cost associated with upgrading an entire pipe system. And so part of the solution they've come up with, and it jives quite well with the local culture of driving to a local spring, and this happens elsewhere in Ontario and Nova Scotia and other places in the Maritime, that driving to get spring water is an activity that people are, that they do. And so the community came up with this concept, and the government is behind this solution and provides funding to build these community wells, basically. And it was a resolution that the community came to terms with after a lot of discussion with themselves, recognizing the cost of improving the pipe system, and instead putting in place this community, this potable water drinking unit, I think is the acronym, where people can go and fill up their own jugs. And so that was one solution that works with what is considered to be acceptable and normal within the community, but perhaps wouldn't work in any jurisdiction across Canada.
That's a great example.
Bernadette, can I just say something?
Yeah, please do.
So one of the areas that I've seen personally where we can use traditional and local knowledge is based on my kind of story. So I'll tell you a story like Terry O'Reilly would tell us all to do. My master's research was looking at the effects of the oil sands on the communities in northern Alberta. And so I used traditional and local knowledge to look at those effects. And based on what I saw, that's what led me to do more technical research on oil sands reclamation. So we can use the traditional and local knowledge to start defining the needs for where we go with what we're doing in terms of that scientific community. So the two of them can kind of go hand in hand. We need them both.
That's great. Thanks for that. Cecilia, I really struck, and we've talked about it before, this idea and we have, I don't know if Heather Castleton's with us, we have a project in looking at traditional environmental knowledge and incorporating Western, but you know, as powerful as Elder Marshall's two-eyed seeing concept is, what I'm struck in this concept is maybe we do ourselves a disservice by saying it's like this kind of knowledge and that kind of knowledge, and how do we get them together, when what we're really talking about is where is the wisdom in the experience that's gained in a different way. So Eric, that's a great example, and really when people are talking, when we're used to the innovation language, it's just thinking out of the box. And I love that, you know, the example about, you know, what about the pelicans. It's really understanding that there are other forms of, and there's a whole set in social science of intuitive knowledge and the different knowledge styles. But I'm really seeing that resonate, and I wonder, because you really do sit in your two sides is people who function culturally in that academic and engineering and technical world, and the First Nations. Where do you see that? Did you see it as a split, or do you see it as a way of thinking out of the box? And have you seen, I guess the whole thing is, have you seen it work? Where have you seen that it actually can come together?
Well, I think that I've seen several examples across Canada when, we go back to that the Big C consultation, when consultation has, it's meaningful. And so you get the First Nations, the Indigenous people at the table early on, not later, not when everything's been decided already, but to talk about what are the issues that they're concerned with. Oftentimes, some of the concerns that we hear may be veiled in mythologies, or even what maybe outside society may see as some sort of unfounded fears. But there's some things that are within communities that I don't know even if people know why they know it. I don't, you know what I mean? Yeah. So they don't know why they know it, but they do know it, that there's an issue. If you look at Elsipogtog, I bring that up quite a bit because you see the protests that happen in New Brunswick. And, more and more just keeps coming out when it comes to Indigenous knowledge. And I told some of the folks when this happened that, you're dealing with centuries-old legends here. You're not going to just deal with it by simply saying, well, tough, we're gonna start hydraulic fracturing. And this comes from this old knowledge that if we begin to listen to the people, they'll tell you that there's an underground river that runs beneath everything that connects Elsipogtog with the rest of the Atlantic region. And you go, well, that sounds kind of far-fetched, really, but it's there. Whether it's real or not, it's certainly real for the people. So how do we make that work? We start addressing that, saying, okay, so let's look into this. Now, when you look at the way that other projects have worked, dams have been built where they've talked to First Nations and said, all right, how do you want this done? And there are ways. And if you ask, you'll get those ways. You'll hear the ways that it can be done. It's not always a no, and I think that oftentimes you hear the no because that's out of the frustration of people not hearing that, we want things done, correctly. Well, what does that mean? And then they just kind of move on because we don't have the translators. We don't have people who are able to interpret that information that's coming out for the folks that don't understand it.
Great, thank you. And for those of you who are waiting to comment, because there's a lot of comments here, remember you were given a task earlier to think about what knowledge to action means in your context. So back to the material, right? This is your opportunity to get up and ask questions and think about it, or give us your own aha moments from these sessions. Because in my view, I always say when we do these panels that it's really good to convey information, but there's a lot of things that people can find by reading your paper or on your website and going to the report. It's really the insights that people share. I mean, this is a social event, but it's really the insights of what people have understood from the conversations and passing that on that's the fastest way to get there. And a special shout out to our international visitors who don't think they're working hard until later today. I would like to hear from some of you as to whether you hear much of this discussion resonates with what you're finding in your own countries, or is it different? Is it the same thing, different temperature, or is it something different? So I think Jackie had a point. So be thinking of moving to the microphones while we go through, and then we'll go. Thanks. Jackie.
I was just going to say that I don't think it's just a question of being able to communicate knowledge or understand that there are different types of knowledge. I think it's also being able to listen and understand that sometimes things that might have technical realities that we have certain understandings of based on our expertise are not the issues that people or communities feel are important or need to be addressed. And one of the issues we talked about in the sessions yesterday was fluoride. There's pretty good technical evidence that fluoride works as a health measure and that it's not too dangerous, but there's a lot of resistance to fluoride. And one of the answers that was brought out was that perhaps the better story to be telling on the industry side is a social justice story. if you don't put fluoride in the water and people of low income don't get access to that fluoride, their children might have very bad teeth, which will place an incredible economic burden on them, which is different. It's a very different story. It's a story about taking care of each other and values and taking care of our children. And at the same time, for those who don't want fluoride in their water, a lot of the time I think that is about an issue of trust in government and whether or not we trust other people to make those decisions for us. So I think if we can not just look across cultures, but also look within cultures to try and see where those opportunities to better understand each other are, we could move forward.
That's well said.
Hi, I'm Dana McDonald, and I'm representing Evergreen. My question is going to take us on a little bit of a tangent, if that's okay. I first want to acknowledge Nicola Crawhall, if she's still in the room, for introducing me to the term shared water stewardship, because I hadn't heard it before, and I love it, and I'm going to keep using it. I also want to thank Jackie for asking me if I see my job as a service, because yes, I do. And my work is around educating and engaging the public in urban watersheds. And in particular, I'm starting a new project exploring shared water stewardship in urban watersheds in Metro Vancouver. So my question is, do you think that facilitating shared water stewardship in Canada's cities is a service? And if so, what is the value of that service?
This is the panel job. What do you think?
Mind blown.
I think it is a service. I think coming together to try and figure out what the best way to bring people to seeing the services that they receive as services, first of all, because I think a lot of times people think about water, and if they don't know a lot about their water services and systems, they don't really think much beyond the tap. So I do think that it's a service to try and reconnect people in an urban environment to the waters and the people that are taking care of their waters and providing them with water services. So yes, I would say so.
And I would add, I also think that shared water stewardship is a service. I'm not sure who, I think we all have a part to play in that. That's what I'd like to, I don't think it's just the city's responsibility. I think, you know, in many cases it's the regulator's responsibility to sort of bring people together, but things like this, events like this, there's real value there as well of bringing people together, and if people are willing to work and are asking for it, if there's a pull, I think we'll fill the void. I think governments will step in perhaps and try and offer that service and facilitate those discussions a little bit more frequently perhaps, and maybe we can have some real headway in a few areas if everyone's working together behind water perhaps.
It would also be great to see education starting at a very young age. So some schools do talk about water issues, but to see that as a common theme throughout your entire life, that will only increase your concern for water. If you do live in a city and you don't have a lot of access to nature, and there have been many studies that have been done that show that children that are exposed to nature have a much higher level of caring for it.
It also strikes me, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in thinking about the things that Terry O'Reilly was doing his job and how much time he sweats over what's the right word because of the different nuances of words. So we've used the word service in this discussion in 3 distinct ways, which are really important. You ask the first, who feels that they're in service, which brings that emotion, that emoting of what your job is. We talk about water services for utilities and the importance of distinguishing between ownership and operation, and this comes into the right for water and the whole public-private partnership, I almost said PPP, public-private partnership debates about water services versus the water itself. And then, and it's interesting, is my discussion with Dr. Vorsmarty after this session, I said, you know, I don't think I would use the word in communicating ecosystems, goods, and services. And he said, well, that's what everybody calls it at every conference I've ever been to. And so I don't think that's, in certain groups, and that's appropriate at the conference, but in your communicating it, you know, are we motivated to make sure we quantify, and we might in a regulatory sense, but quantify to where you want to get to? Is it about getting people to want to quantify the services that they provide, or are we want to articulate what those services are? Is it about wetlands being the lungs of the watershed and that ability, and if you want to go there. So it strikes me just the nuance and with apologies to the French-speaking half of the country, it's hard enough I'm seeing even just in English within the North American English that nuance is important. So I would say we all have to kind of think about the question. So I think your question is an important one, and I think the intent, listening to the answers, is shared here. But you're actually getting different answers from people depending on where they think your question is going. So I really appreciate that, because that was a bit of an aha for me about even when I think I'm doing it, the hardest thing to do, especially for people like me, is to boil it down into a few simple words. So that is the hardest task. The hardest task is not to make it complicated and put all the detail in, and that needs to be done in the peer-reviewed system. By far the hardest task is actually to boil it down to that, but I think you're getting some good wisdom from the group of where your question was going. Other thoughts on?
Could I add to
Eric?
that? I guess being one of the representatives of a conservation authority, we have that challenge that we're dealing with. We're representing 3 municipalities in the region of Peel, so Toronto, Brampton, and Mississauga. They all have different definitions of what a service would be through the conservation authority, and all of that leads to Bernadette's message. It tends to complicate and become complicated with Conservation Ontario and then the Credit Valley Conservation right along our borders. That starts to escalate the complication, and it's a challenge. It's a real challenge for the conservation authorities to not only get along, but actually find a way to define your question.
I have a follow-up question if no one else is approaching the mic.
See what happens when you don't run to the microphone? Yeah, then somebody gets to go there. And I'm looking, I want my international friends in the crowd to be brave and give us a little insight, because I wasn't in all the sessions, so. Go ahead.
One of the panelists made a comment about government filling the void in the shared water stewardship conversation, and I'm wondering who's the right person or group or body to facilitate the shared water stewardship initiatives. Is it government? Is it nonprofit? Is it academia? Is it the public to step up? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
You guys have been talking about that for a few days. What do you think? Who is the right person or the right group? There's my hint.
It's like monitoring. What's the right parameter? What's the right, end of pipe limit? I think it depends on the environment that you're in, perhaps, what watershed you're in, where you are. So I guess it depends. Would be my take on that. Whose responsibility it is.
And can you think of an example? Because it's just really helpful for sort of concrete examples. So I mean, we keep reinforcing these concepts of it's where there's the trusted relationship and you've established it. So we talk about creating the regulatory pieces, or even from a market sense, the financial pieces of within which you can work. But can you give me an example, and I know you have several from the regulator side, where that happened, where that either serendipitously happened or as a part of process, and there was, can you give us an example of what that looks like?
Who are the trusted sort of knowledge brokers, or who
Well,
are
just
the trusted
just a concrete
groups?
example of where you've seen it happen, where there's been a trust, and it's, this has worked well in terms of
Right.
communication between government and a watershed-based group.
I think depending on where you sit, government is a trusted person or a trusted entity, or it is not. And I think we've moved a lot to government not being questioned a bit more, not being really a trusted resource by most environmental groups in particular over the last few years. But I do think, there are groups who do it very well. Like in New Brunswick, a good example, the New Brunswick Environmental Network is a real trusted resource. It's trusted by government, and it's trusted by the watershed associations.
So it serves as a broker.
They're a fair broker, and so and they routinely bring groups together to talk about various issues, whether it's climate change adaptation, flood mitigation, watershed management, nutrient loading, children in the environment even, and the environmental impacts on children in the environment. And they do it really well. And so government likes to go to those meetings because they're not getting beat up.
Do they push an issue up that they bring the other to, or do they respond when government wants? Do they wait till that gets set up and then they kind of astutely come in and broker? Or are they the ones that are pushing forward the issue that needs to be brokered?
They work both ways. They serve a bit of an advocacy role at times by conveying messages up. Oftentimes they are funded in part through Environmental Trust Fund. For the Department of Environment, we have a trust fund that we give out. And they're very successful every time because they deliver results of bringing the right people together. And it's knowledge integration, and it's actionable discussions. Yeah.
So great, there we have a knowledge broker sometimes leading the fact that there's a discussion and then being there to support it and sometimes responding. Jackie, I thought you had
I was just
an
going to
example.
say, I think the Okanagan Basin Water Board is a good example of that, and I think that they have shown a lot more leadership in terms. They're in British Columbia, and their board is made up of municipal representatives and 2 scientific advisors, and they have a water stewardship expert panel as well, board that advises them and gives them a lot of science to support their decision making. And because of having that dynamic of bringing scientists also to the table to work with councillors to figure out where to move forward, I think they've made a lot of progress in shared water governance and being able to bring that balance of both community needs and science into watershed management.
Right, and I think for those, and Jackie will know the examples, the similarity, I think, between the Okanagan Basin Water Board and Halifax Water is that within you need to know the details, but within the structures that are common in Canada, those are the 2 examples where there's a combination of regulatory authority or an expected, so that they've actually given them powers to tax and responsibilities for the board. So there are things that they've been, in the governance sense, that they've been given the authority to do, but they don't have the whole regulatory oversight, and there's a certain removal. So when Carl talked, I know how important that is for our municipal groups, that idea, but when there's a certain level of ability to operate without everything under the lens of a municipal decision, I think Okanagan Water Board it's very different structure, but it's in that middle space, isn't it?
Yes, and they have funding. So they have a property tax piece that goes specifically to the board, and I think that makes a huge difference. They are both independent enough, integrate enough, and have a funding source to support doing research. So they actually fund research in their watershed and to answer specific questions that they have and their municipalities have.
That's
and
great.
Develop tools.
Great example, and I'm going to come to Desigan because he was cut, but I want to go to Eric. Did you have another, because I love these examples of things. Do you have an example of where you've seen that happen?
I think what we're seeing right now is the responsibility of the Conservation Authority is reaching out to different stakeholders within their community and sharing the responsibility, whether it be the private sector, the public funding sector, and the community stakeholders. So in our side, our group was actually created from the advancement of sustainability around the airport. The airport decided to take an initiative and create a group that fostered sustainability and innovation to influence the business community around them. And it was in relation to the Etobicoke-Minamico watershed, and that was the reason.
So what was the driver? Was it purely that we have to do this to meet a regulatory approval? Was we needed buy-in for the community? What was the driver to organize around that airport piece?
They wanted the Pearson Airport area to be known as an international community of industrial end users, because everybody that comes into Canada from an international location has to go through Pearson Airport. As a result of that, the industrial end users around the airport are working together to work on water stewardship initiatives that benefit the cities around the airport, which is the GTA, and the Toronto Region Conservation Authority.
So another doing good by doing well example. That's great. Desigan, thank you. You want to introduce yourself? There may be a few, most of us know you, but there might be a few new people in the room.
Okay. Sure. You looked around a few times and said, "Where's my friend?" So we're here. I'm Desigan Dadu from South Africa, and I want to return to the traditional knowledge issue. I think the first issue is about finding the resonance of the right language to use. So we don't talk about traditional knowledge. Where I come from, we talk about indigenous knowledge, and we extend it to talk about indigenous knowledge systems. The second issue is what status you give it in your conversation. And we've worked fairly hard to raise the status substantially. So in the academic domain, for example, we now have research chairs in indigenous knowledge systems. So it's become very integrated into mainstream solution mechanisms rather than on the fringe, which is generally where it is. And it's had some good resonance and some good results. I mean, 3 areas where it has worked well in our domain. One is around getting very strong community buy-in around restoration of wetlands, and this has worked extraordinarily well. A second area is in the nutritional security domain around mainstreaming indigenous crops, and there's a fair amount of work that's been done there that's been really useful. And the domain we're working now with some international partners like the Gates Foundation is around developing point-of-use systems for water quality. And it's absolutely astounding what you get out of it. So we now have combinations of certain kinds of clay vessels that have been used for possibly hundreds of years in our parts of the world, with the addition of some nanomaterials, and have created very, very innovative new solutions that won't only be good for us, but good for a lot of places in the world. And it also allows you to have the conversation in a different way. And it vastly increases the number of options that you would have available.
Thank you. Comments?
I think that there is more and more research being done in Canada that would be similar to that, that would be on the use of Indigenous knowledge, or even incorporating Indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge here. So it is becoming more prevalent. For example, at the University of Saskatchewan, there's a group that studies the major deltas in Canada, the Saskatchewan River Delta, the Peath-Athabasca Delta, just two examples, and they are incorporating traditional knowledge into their research. So they're using all forms of knowledge and trying to bring that together and to connect the two together to build those bridges. So there is a lot more work that's being done on that. That's just one example.
In just to be quick, in my experience in an international context, anytime you want to go and explore for biological purposes or from the social science perspective, there's always an aspect of community engagement, whether it's an interview or a focus group, or you're in the most remote community possible, talking to a fisherman, trying to catch him in between going out onto the water. No matter what the topic is, I think it's been happening in international research for a very long time, and there are established frameworks and protocols for different types of research. And as you said, it's starting to come in Canada, and I think we're really starting to appreciate the Indigenous and traditional knowledge that we have within our own country, and not just when we travel to other countries. So it's definitely one of those trending topics. I like saying that.
So it means different things to trending to us. So now I'm learning hashtag.
I wanted to make a comment about the distinction between traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. It's actually correct to say Indigenous knowledge here as well. Lots of folks use the terminology traditional knowledge. I think that it's, for me, it's an old term. It's something that was used in the past. We say, I think DFO likes ATK, Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge. Then you hear traditional ecological knowledge. And I find Indigenous knowledge to be more encompassing. So yeah, it's not just in South Africa or anywhere. It's here as well. But most people are still using that term, traditional knowledge. So
Yeah, thank you. I come from a biology standpoint, so when I was doing it, it's always TEK. So it's good to know.
IK.
Oh, there we go.
That's great. Other thoughts? I'm looking at Adam, and he's going, no, she's coming to me. Because Adam, and because I'm not sure if David's in the room, so I can pick on Adam, coming from Australia. One thing that's interesting is you go home after this afternoon, we go into our Global Water Research Coalition meeting, and really a lot of the discussion around that is exactly what we're talking about here. The end game is, where do we help direct and manage research in our countries in a way that gets the best value? And why I'm asking Adam to talk is, for those of you who are, you know that many of the examples that we held up and still do hold up come from Australia, because we talk about the Israeli example, we talk about the Australian example, and a lot people kept asking about, does it have to be a crisis? And really what happened was a 7-year drought, something had to be done, and now Australia finds itself in a very different space in terms of, I won't say it's politically, but publicly in terms of the mindset. And so I'm really curious, as you listen to this, Adam, where it's the question is, these are the things we want to do, we know it's hard work, but we're not sure if we can get the investment, the political will, the pieces to do it. Does this resonate with what's happening in Australia at the moment, or do you have some thoughts for us? Because I love the accent anyway, so we're doing.
Thanks. Yeah, we almost went through two crises. We had the drought, and then, of course, huge floods. So we went through massive investment, and the investment we had in water security was second only to mining. So, billions and billions of dollars spent on water recycling plants, and some of that water recycling infrastructure is now being pulled out, believe it or not. Water recycling projects can't even get up in Australia anymore because we've got desal in all the capital cities. Water efficiency works well. It's almost like a mindset. So all the restrictions that were in place during the drought, people have kept it at that level. So even though utilities will say to their customers, go for your life, use as much as you want, because we're charging at the long run marginal cost, so we've charged for the next supply, customers have kept down their water levels, water use levels. So it's been an amazing journey in many respects. But what we're also finding is that we've found that water is an A to Z issue, and I talked about this in the session yesterday. At the time, it was an A issue. It is now very clearly a Z issue. So now the federal government has got practically zero interest in urban water, which means that we as an industry, and I think this is what you're trying to do here, as an industry, we're trying to tell the story. We're trying to reset the direction without any help from the government at all. They're pulling all their money off the table. They're pulling any interest in policy levers off the table. So we have to do it. We have to do it as an industry. So what I'd say, what resonates for me here is that you're actually doing it without a crisis sort of around. Obviously, you've got some flooding issues with climate change, but it's a good place to be, but it's bloody hard work. It's really hard work. So we're in the same place, except we've been through two crises and people have just switched off. They've actually switched off. So all I would say is continue the journey. That's what you're trying to do here, but you've got to keep it going, and it's really hard work.
Thanks, Al. I think what I took out of some of these discussions is, and I keep trying to change my own language, is that even the way I introduced it with this idea that if there's a crisis, we'll respond and we're humans, and if there's not, and we talked, and Deska and I think and others talked about the boiling frog analogy, and that's true. But perhaps the lesson from last night is that we have to talk about, we do have, it's like Pat Mulroy said, you must have problems you want to solve, and everybody in this room knows there's problems we want to solve. So it's not about whether there's a national crisis or a regional or there isn't, it's whether there's a compelling story or not. There's a compelling need. So if we start thinking about what is the compelling need, which becomes the compelling narrative, maybe that's the Canadian need to go forward and maybe similar for you. So. Any other questions? Because I'm about, this is one of those things where you go and it's like, oh, I really wished I asked that question and I didn't get them at lunch. Now is your time, because I'm about to stop.
Okay,
See?
I'll give it a shot.
I should have started earlier with that line.
I needed to get up and get some exercise. My name's Grant Murphy. I'm with the University of Waterloo. I want to shift the conversation a little bit because I want to get your opinions and insight into this. I've been hearing a lot about, and I've lived through this, we've all lived through this, water in our country is abundant. We can get up in the morning and turn on the tap, flush the toilet, etc. Is water a right or is it a privilege? And I was thinking about this in terms of what Terry was talking about last night, trying to change the conversation a little bit. And maybe I'm totally off base, but I wanted to understand where everyone's thoughts were on this. Because if we made it and put it in that perspective that it's a privilege to have water, and I don't mean it in terms of us against them, but as a privilege, as something that we appreciate and something that is meaningful to our lives, would that make a difference in some of the work that we're doing here and we're talking about? So that's my comment, question, go from there.
Great, thank you. A really good one, and a question we get a lot on these panels, and I'll put it to a couple of you because I think in listening to the wording, your question really is, are we privileged to have it, and does that make it a privilege? And how is that different from a right?
I think that there are areas where, water is a human right. We've talked about that. But we are very privileged in the developed parts of Canada. There are certainly communities that don't seem to have that privilege, that don't have the right to that water for some reason, and we need to be bridging that gap. But it's a really interesting discussion, especially when you talk about valuation of water as well, and how do you price it properly and balancing the right versus the privilege. It's not an easy question to answer.
I immediately thought to the David Suzuki Blue Dot campaign. I'm not sure if we're familiar with that, but I wanted to just focus on that I think clean water is a right. And I think that lots of places, as you said, in Canada, in the more developed areas, we do often, we don't recognize how privileged we are, and our perception on water might be skewed. So I don't know where to take it from there, but yeah.
I think it's interesting because I think that it's actually more that clean water as a right is a goal. Because it's a very expensive and very difficult thing to do.
Yes.
And I actually find it interesting because yesterday Oliver pointed out that we're not normal people, that we think about water a lot. To the point where when I look at people, I think, oh yeah, you're 2/3 water, just you're connected to that glass of water there because you are made up of water and you need that water. So I think we need to have those kinds of discussions where we try and get other people to think about the integral part that water plays in our lives and how we can provide services to make sure that that water that goes inside is clean and safe.
From an industrial end user landscape, so I worked in the tech sector from the US side for 9 years prior to joining TRCA. The privileged concept for industrial end user manufacturing is only a concern for them when it becomes a restriction. So in the states of drought in the US, that scares those companies because now they have restrictions. They have permit restrictions, they have extraction restrictions. That's not too far along for Canada to experience. I live in Guelph. A lot of the residents in Guelph battled, I guess, Nestle getting into Aberfoyle. That's a real-time example of what happened in the US that could easily happen here. The challenge is once it becomes a restriction for industrial end users, they see it as a loss of privilege. Until then, the shortages that we're not experiencing, that's obviously going to be something that limits them to see it as that perspective.
Thanks for that. So I would say, because I'm a cup half full girl, the fact that we're having these debates, so before it was just putting the debate on the table. And so these discussions about whether, about rights and privileges and the legalities of that and the nuance of that and the importance are one I would actually challenge this whole group. And I guess I would leave the thought with, when I've heard these discussions, it's the getting into, in the rights, is it the right to the water, or is it the right to safe water, or is it a right to what it preserves? And the analogy I use is, what if we used food in the same sentence? Like, do we have famines? So it's really thinking about what it is that we as a society designate as sort of society rights and personal rights. So it's an excellent question, and I think it has gotten very polarized, as Maggie talked about, which is not a reason not to have the conversation. It's have a conversation of first hear what that person is saying and get into it. So I would encourage it. David, your last question, because Caitlin's looking at me with daggers here.
Somebody over here too.
Well, you guys are gonna have to flip for it then.
Do we have time for? Mine's just quickly a comment.
Okay.
And then you can ask the question. Just to go back to who
you just have to eat faster, I'm just saying.
Okay. Just the earlier conversation on who should take the lead on shared watershed management. And we talked about the possibility, I think the answer was depends. And when government can take the lead on that, I think it's really difficult in a lot of cases that we've experienced, where government takes the lead. Like I talked about the Britannia one yesterday, and there was no way government's going to take the lead on that. But I think a more relevant one and recent one is one that Pete Steblin and I've been working on in the Lower Mainland, and that is his response to the Alberta floods a year and a half ago. And again, there was a multi-jurisdictional issue. They got caught unprepared. So what we're doing right now in the Lower Mainland is try to learn from that. And now we brought together 44 funding partners. I think as Charles was saying yesterday, we've got to get back to the financial aspects of it. in order to get them to get involved and get skin in the game, each one of them is putting some money into the table, and it's public and private groups that are coming together. But it took an independent entity because no government or private sector interest was going to be able to do it. So in a lot of cases, you need to find that independent entity that's going to act as the catalyst.
Right, and again, in that broker role, did that broker respond to, here's the problem, we're putting out an RFP, please bring a broker in, or was it the broker that saw the pieces and kind of put it forward? Who put it up there so that somebody decided to do something about it?
The broker was basically us. It was the Fraser Basin Council, and because we had the links to both public and private sector interests and forwarders of government, including the First Nations, we were able to go out there and attract the involvement of every single one of those entities.
So we're starting to talk about brokers to articulate the issue as opposed to brokers to solve a clearly
Well, to
phrased
articulate,
question.
define, and go and get the resources to be able to do it. And I think the Okanagan Water Board is a good example, but and the conservation authorities, but they're primarily local government interests. So, there's a certain narrowness there that how do you get those other interests to the table? Anyway, that's for another discussion.
That's
Can
a
I
great,
comment on that really
no, that's a
briefly?
great example. You get one quick comment and then we're going to our last question. Look,
I
they're
think
having to
there's
ask me.
two
Dave.
good examples in that. It's my favorite Winston Churchill quote of never letting a good crisis go to waste. So good on you for doing that. And I think it's government's accused of having the stick and the carrot all the time. I think this is a great example of where the government needs a carrot sometimes too to bring it along. So I think we need some of that as well.
Yeah, so in the creating the parade, it was a broker in responding to that created the first marching band for people to join, perhaps. Thanks for that, David. Last question.
Right. So it's not actually a question, it's a comment. And,
But not, I know you, but not everybody
okay,
knows
my
you.
name is Matt. Some of you may know me from handing out those annoying surveys. I apologize. But anyways, so I felt compelled to say this, and I was close enough to the microphone that I wanted to say it. But we've talked a lot about in this conference about communication. So it's actually, I have a request for everyone in this room, because I've gone to conferences before, and there's so many good ideas here, but we're just one room in one city. But the breadth of influence in this room is very wide. So take the ideas from, and we've talked a lot about communication. We had the marketing guy come in last night, Terry, and I really liked that. It was good, because communication is key, and they know a lot about communication and people. So take the ideas, this is a request from me. So from me. Take the ideas that you enjoyed, because we all enjoyed different parts of this, right? But spread it. Tell people. Use your influence and tell other people. And that's my question for everyone.
That's not a question, that's a welcome admonition to the group. So I like those, we'll close those last two comments, because what it speaks to is by design, this conference is a group which is collectively a broker entity that has the potential to do what David's talked about, is see the pieces and where the opportunity exists. It's actually, those who put up your hand to say you want to serve and some of the pieces, you're basically now blessed with the responsibility that you're probably in the best positions to be sort of collectively that broker that brings it forward. So thank you so much. Like I said, the future looks to me in good hands, but they want us to help them. I want them to lead, but they need us together. But let's show them a round of applause for that.